Hey friends, it's Lindsay Stitches. Welcome to my channel. If you're new here, I am a hand embroidery artist in Australia, and in 2022 I am doing my second embroidery journal where I'm stitching one thing every day for the whole year. If you want to learn about the first embroidery journal that I did in 2020, or you want a tutorial on starting your own, then you should go and check out my first video. And in my second video I kind of went through how I decide what memory to stitch every day of the year, even on the boring days, and how I turn a memory or an experience into something that I can stitch into my journal. In this video, I'm going to talk about the size and placement of all the little pictures on my journal and how I managed to stitch 30 or so things into each little segment. I'm also going to show you a few of my favorite versions of this project that I follow or have found on Instagram. And last of all, I will show you some of my favorite memories and things that I stitched in March. Okay, so the question that I probably get asked the most when I post photos of my embroidery journal is about what size hoop that I use. So for my first embroidery journal in 2020, I used a 200mm hoop, which is about 8 inches, I think. And this year I am stitching on a 225mm hoop, which is 9 inches. So it's only very slightly bigger. With the 2022 picture in the middle of the hoop, it kind of makes each segment about 100mm long and about 60mm wide at the outside part of the hoop. I'm not going to do the maths to work out the area of those segments, but it does not leave a lot of space to stitch a month's worth of memories. Stitching in such a small space can be really tricky, especially if you're a beginner. I have been stitching for many years and it still is a challenge for me sometimes. I think the main thing is probably actually like drawing the picture. I sometimes draw something and then I hate how it looks, or it doesn't look like what I want it to look like, and draw it again, and sometimes I can do that like 10 times before I actually get it to look the way that I want it to. If you do a very vague sort of pattern for yourself to follow, then sometimes just stitching it is actually the better way to go. So my process for deciding how big to make things and where to put them on my hoop is pretty flexible, just like everything that I do. I will be totally honest and tell you that I definitely don't actually stitch something onto my journal every day, especially since I started YouTube and I want to film a update video on the previous month before I start stitching the current month. So today is the 21st of April and I haven't stitched a single thing for April yet, so I'm already 3 weeks behind. Once I've finished filming this, I've got a fair bit to catch up on, but essentially this means that instead of spending maybe, you know, like 5 minutes to 20 minutes every day stitching something on my journal, I kind of spend like an entire day or even more sometimes catching up on stitching like 21 things. Even though I'm not stitching things on the day that they happened, I do still try to mostly stitch everything in date order. Ideally, I would like to be doing it every few days rather than every few weeks, but I think leaving it longer does also have its benefits. So for example, if you are catching up on like a week's worth of stitching and you have a general idea of everything that you want to stitch, you can determine the size of what you're stitching by the significance of that memory, if that makes sense. Like if I have to really think hard to try and come up with something to stitch on a particular day, I probably want to give that less prominence on my embroidery journal than something that represents a really fun or exciting memory. You don't want to stitch a bunch of boring things really big and then get to the end of the month and have like the greatest day of your life and not have enough room to stitch what you want to represent that. So stitching in batches kind of helps me to stitch like smaller things and bigger things evenly throughout the month, and I can sort of look at it like midway through the month and figure out if I need to adjust the way that I'm stitching things. But you kind of get used to it after a couple of months of stitching tiny little things, how much room you're going to need and how to manage fitting everything that you need into your month. On top of all of this, the self-imposed deadline to post a photo of my embroidery journal within the first few days of a new month is basically all the motivation I need to actually get everything done. I don't have any sort of rules or structure for how I place things. I just put everything in there randomly. You might end up with a few weird sort of gaps in your segments doing it that way, but once it's all kind of filled in, you can barely tell that they're there. Something that I have thought about doing on my embroidery journal is actually adding like stars and dots in the weird little gaps like people do with their tattoos, just to fill in some of the sections that have nothing in them. But I think because everything is so small already, it would be hard to differentiate between what was an actual memory and what is just a little filler thing. So because I'm not a super great help and I basically just tell you that everything that I do is without rhyme or reason, I thought I would show you some of the other ways that I've seen people plan their embroidery journals. So first up, I've seen a few people on Instagram set up a bit of a template or a plan on their segment before they start stitching for the month. I've seen some people do circles or numbers for the dates in their segment so they know where each thing is going to be and how big it's going to be. My Instagram friend Maria was inspired by my embroidery journal in 2020 and she actually did a watercolor version of it in 2021. So Maria actually used coins to plan out a template for her watercolor journal, and then she used those circles to paint inside of. Everything that she painted on there is so tiny but so detailed and it's incredible. Next up, one of my favorite embroidery journals that I've seen is by La Casa del Milo on Instagram. Instead of setting up each segment like a clock like mine is, they have set up their hoop with some more organic sort of shapes for each month. I think this hoop is so beautiful and I love how it kind of looks like a map with all of the different line stitches around each segment. It makes me want to start mine all over again and do it this way. Another version of an embroidery journal that I really love is by Christy, who goes by Someday Stitches on Instagram. Christy wanted to do an embroidery journal but was worried about getting behind and ending up with one big unfinished piece. So instead she decided to stitch each month on its own separate hoop, which not only allows more space to stitch each picture, but it means that every month is a piece of art and an amazing collection of memories in its own right, and she doesn't have to worry about getting 6 months in and abandoning the project completely. Now let's take a look at some of my favorite memories from March and what I stitched to represent them. On the 4th of March, I caught the train to work for the first time, so I stitched the train. I was really nervous about catching the train because I was worried that I would end up in the middle of nowhere and not at all where I needed to be, but I managed to get to work in time to go and get a coffee even before I started, so it was all good. And now I am obsessed with catching the train to work. I would never drive to work again. On the 7th of March, I took Josh to Strike Bowling in Frio as a surprise, so for that I stitched a little bowling pin. On the 8th of March, I started reading a book that I bought called I Didn't Do the Thing Today, so for that I stitched basically the design that's on the front cover of the book. The book is by Madeline Dorr. It was really helpful and reassuring for me as somebody who is constantly comparing the way that I work to the way that others work. On the 12th of March, I went to a few op shops and I got a few awesome things. I got Trivial Pursuit, the 1983 version, which I stitched the little, one of the little thingies for. I can answer probably like 10% of the questions in the older version of Trivial Pursuit, but I could honestly play it for hours. Also on that day at the op shop, I picked up a pair of pink pants that are super cute. I wore them on the 13th, so I stitched them for that day. They're just from Cotton On originally, but they're actually really comfy. On the 15th, I bought myself a sewing machine off Facebook Marketplace, so I stitched the sewing machine. I have exactly the same sewing machine back at home in Tassie and I've been missing it, so I'm really excited to start making some of my own clothes again. So the next day I was on the train home from work and I was thinking about all of the things that you can get done while you're on the train rather than when you're driving home from work, and I looked up and there was a woman across from me crocheting a pink and purple blanket, and it was so cute and so wholesome, and so I stitched her little blanket there. On the 17th, I had my first encounter with a spider in the car while I was driving. I was on my way to the train station to pick Josh up from work. I was only about 2 minutes from home and it appeared on the dash on the passenger side, and it was like walking around and getting on the windscreen, and I was terrified. I thought about stopping, but I decided to try and be brave and make it the like 10 minutes or so that I had to drive to get to the train station. I was like shaking and my heart was absolutely racing, and I must have looked so funny to anybody who drove past me because I was like trying to keep calm and breathe. Anyway, I made it to the train station. All was good. Josh dealt with it, and yeah. On the 18th, work was really quiet in the afternoon, so I got sent home early. I decided to be spontaneous and catch the train into the city to meet Josh when he finished work so we could go and get a drink together. I was really excited that I got to leave work early on a Friday afternoon, so I spent $20 on a cocktail. By the 24th of March, I had not started stitching anything on my embroidery journal for that month yet. I spent pretty much the entire day sitting on this couch stitching, catching up for March. On the 29th of March, after having it written in my Google Docs for literally months, I finally posted the second part of my blog about moving to Western Australia. One of the photos that I included in that blog was of me at the airport with a bunch of moving bags, so I decided to stitch one of the big blue Bunnings moving bags for that day. And that is pretty much it for my March update on my embroidery journal. Thank you so much for following along. I hope that these videos are somewhat helpful, or at least a little bit of fun to watch. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, then please give me a like and subscribe to my channel. And if you have any questions about embroidery journals, or you want any tips for starting your own, then ask me in the comments and I will try to get to them in my next update. So happy stitching, and I will see you in the next video.